Hey gang, my phone decided to randomly stop recording at 11 minutes and 37 seconds, so I am going to pick it up where we left off. If that happens again, just understand that's what went down. Okay. Marion Peters came back from the kitchen. She was a tall woman with worried eyes who had once possessed a fresh American loveliness. Charlie had never been sensitive to it, and was always surprised when people spoke of how pretty she had been. From the first, there had been an instinctive antipathy between them. In other words, from the very first time they met, Charlie and Marion, his wife's sister, Charlie and Marion did not get along. It was just antipathy means a bad feeling between them. "Well, how do you find Honoria?" she asked. "Wonderful. I was astonished how much she's grown in 10 months. All the children are looking well. We haven't had a doctor for a year. How do you like being back in Paris?" "It seems very funny to see so few Americans around." "I'm delighted," Marion said vehemently. "Now, at last, you can go into a store without their assuming you're a millionaire. We've suffered like everybody, but on the whole, it's a good deal pleasanter." "But it was nice while it lasted," Charlie said. "We were sort of a royalty, almost infallible, with a sort of magic around us. In the bar this afternoon," he stumbled, seeing his mistake, "there wasn't a man I knew." She looked at him keenly. "I should think you'd have had enough of bars." "I only stayed a minute. I take one drink every afternoon, and no more." So Charlie says he takes one drink every afternoon, no more. And Marion, when he said he stumbled, realizing his mistake, he subconsciously just said, "Oh yeah, when I was at the bar," and then he's like, "Oh man, Marion doesn't like that I drink," so that's why he has to explain, "I only have one drink every day, that's it." "I only stayed a minute. I take one drink every afternoon and no more." "Don't you want a cocktail before dinner?" Lincoln asked. "No, I take only one drink every afternoon, and I've had that." "Well, I hope you keep to it," said Marion. Her dislike was evident in the coldness with which she spoke, but Charlie only smiled. He had larger plans. Her very aggressiveness gave him an advantage, and he knew enough to wait. He wanted them to initiate the discussion of what they knew had brought him to Paris. At dinner, he couldn't decide whether Honoria was most like him or her mother. Fortunate if she didn't combine the traits of both that had brought them to disaster. A great wave of protectiveness went over him. That was kind of foreshadowing there, by the way. Fortunate if she didn't have the traits of both that brought them to disaster. So we don't know what happened with Helen and Charlie, but it is apparently disastrous. A great wave of protectiveness went over him. He thought he knew what to do for her. He believed in character. He wanted to jump back a whole generation and trust in character again as the eternally valuable element. Everything wore out. And that's what I was talking about with the lost generation. That line right there, he believed in character and wanted to jump back a whole generation and trust in character again. He's saying, man, I wish we could go back to before World War I, when humanity kind of just blew itself up, to when you could trust people's word, and when people were, there was clear right and clear wrong, and before humans decided to become so evil. He left soon after dinner, but not to go home. He was curious to see Paris by night with a clearer and more judicious eyes than those of other days. He brought a strapontine for the casino and watched Josephine Baker go through her chocolate arabesques. After an hour, he left and strolled toward Montmartre, up the Rue Pigalle into the Place Blanche. The rain had stopped, and there were a few people in the evening clothes disembarking from taxis in front of cabarets and cocottes, prowling singly or in pairs, and many black folk. He passed a lighted door from which issued music, and stopped with a sense of familiarity. It was Bricktop's, where he had parted with so many hours and so much money. A few doors farther on, and he found another ancient rendezvous, and incautiously put his head inside. Immediately, an eager orchestra burst into sound. A pair of professional dancers leaped to their feet, and a maitre d'hotel swooped towards him, crying, "Crowd just arriving, sir!" But he withdrew quickly. You'd have to be damn drunk, he thought. So Charlie sticks his head in this restaurant, and all of a sudden, boom, the place pops to life. There was nothing going on. Everybody's sitting down doing nothing. As soon as he sticks his head in and looks around the corner, the band strikes up, the maitre d' jumps up, a waiter comes. It's like, oh, yeah, no, it's going to get busy. But it's probably not, because now that all the Americans have left town, the economic depression has set back in. Zelli's was closed. The bleak and sinister cheap hotels surrounding it were dark. Up in the Rue Blanche there was more light and a local colloquial French crowd. The poet's cave had disappeared, but the two great mouths of the Cafe of Heaven and Cafe of Hell still yawned, even devoured, as he watched, the meager contents of a tourist bus, a German, a Japanese, and an American couple who glanced at him with frightened eyes. So much for the effort and ingenuity of Montmartre. All the catering to vice and waste was on an utterly childish scale, and he suddenly realized the meaning of the word dissipate. To dissipate into thin air. To make nothing out of something. I pause and go slowly there because that word dissipate comes back later. If you have something and you waste it or fritter it away, to dissipate really means if there's an odor or smell, it dissipates as it spreads out and it gets less and less. But if you apply it to your life or to personal decisions, dissipating means to have something of value and then slowly waste it, fritter it away, usually money. Okay, to make nothing out of something. In the little hours of the night, every move from place to place was an enormous human jump, an increase of paying for the privilege of slower and slower motion. He remembered 1,000-franc notes given to an orchestra for playing a single number, 100-franc notes tossed to a doorman for calling a cab, but it hadn't been given for nothing. It had been given, even the most wildly squandered sums, as an offering to destiny, that he might not remember the things most worth remembering, the things that now he would always remember. His child taken from his control, his wife escaped to a grave in Vermont. So we find out that Charlie's wife Helen is actually dead, and his child Honoria is no longer in his control. So legally he has lost custody of Honoria. In the glare of a brasserie, a woman spoke to him. He bought her some eggs and coffee, and then, eluding her encouraging stare, gave her a 20-franc note and took a taxi to his hotel. So if you are reading along, that's the end of part 1, and now we begin part 2. As I said, I think there's 5 parts. Or maybe I didn't say that, I don't remember. He woke up on a fine fall day, football weather. The depression of yesterday was gone, and he liked the people on the streets. At noon, he sat opposite Honoria at Le Grand Vatel, the only restaurant he could think of not reminiscent of champagne dinners and long luncheons that began at 2 and ended in a blurred and vague twilight. Now, how about vegetables? Oughtn't you have some vegetables? Well, yes. Oh, here's epinards and chou-fleur and carrots and haricots. I'd like chou-fleur. Wouldn't you like to have 2 vegetables? I usually only have 1 at lunch. The waiter was pretending to be inordinately fond of children. Que es mignon l'appétit de parler excellent comme un français. I don't know what that means. It means something about a small child being cute. And how about dessert? Shall we wait and see? The waiter disappeared. Honoria looked at her father expectantly. What are we going to do? Well, first, we're going to go to that toy store in Rue Saint-Honore and buy you anything you like, and then we're going to the vaudeville show at the Empire. She hesitated. I like it about the vaudeville, but not the toy store. Why not? Well, you bought me this doll. She had it with her. And I've got lots of things. And we're not rich anymore, are we? We never were, said Charlie. But today, you are to have anything you want. All right, she agreed resignedly. When there had been her mother and a French nurse, he had been inclined to be strict, but now he extended himself. He reached out for a new tolerance. He must be both parents to her now, and not shut any of her out of communication. I want to get to know you, he said gravely. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Charles J. Wells of Prague. Oh, Daddy, her voice creaked with laughter. And who are you, please? He persisted. She accepted a role immediately. Honoria Wales, Rue Palatine, Paris. Married or single? No, not married, single. He indicated the doll. But I see you have a child, madam. Unwilling to disinherit it, she took it to her heart and thought quickly. Oh, yes, I've been married, but I'm not married now. My husband is dead, he went on quickly. And the child's name? Simone, that's after my best friend at school. I'm very pleased that you're doing so well at school. I'm 3rd this month, she boasted. Elsie, that was her cousin, is only about 18, and Richard's about at the bottom. So back in the day, especially in Europe, they would actually just rank you. Just like 1 through whatever, 50, and the 50th in the class, you were the dum-dum. We don't do that anymore. That's kind of rude. I mean, we kind of do with the top 10 for graduation and all, but that's only at the top. Okay. You like Richard and Elsie, don't you? Oh, yes. And I like Richard quite well. I like her all right. Cautiously and casually, he asked. And Aunt Marion and Uncle Lincoln. Which do you like best? Um, Uncle Lincoln, I guess. He was increasingly aware of her presence. As they came in, a murmur of adorable followed them, and now the people at the next table bent all of their silences upon her, staring as if she were something no more conscious than a flower. Why don't I live with you? She asked suddenly. Because Mom is dead? You must stay here and learn more French. It would have been hard for Daddy to take care of you so well. Well, I don't really need much taking care of anymore. I do everything for myself. Going to the restaurant, a man and woman unexpectedly hailed him. Well, the old Wells! Hello, Lorraine, Dunk. Sudden ghosts out of the past. Duncan Schaefer, a friend from college, and Lorraine Quarles, a lovely, pale blonde of 30, one of a crowd who had helped them make months into days in the lavish time of 3 years ago. My husband couldn't come this year, she said, in answer to his question. We're poor as hell, so he gave me $200 a month and told me I could do my worst on that. Is this your little girl? What about coming back and sitting down? Duncan asked. I can't do it. He was glad for an excuse. As always, he felt Lorraine's passionate, provocative attraction, but his own rhythm was different now. Well, how about dinner? She asked. I'm not free. Give me your address and let me call you. Charlie, I believe you're sober, she said judicially. I honestly believe he's sober, Dunk. Pinch him, see if he's sober. Charlie indicated Honoria with his head, and they both laughed. So he's like, hey, I got a kid here. Stop saying sober around my 9-year-old who doesn't know what that means. Okay. Well, what's your address? Said Duncan skeptically. He hesitated, unwilling to give him the name of his hotel. You know what? I'm not settled yet. I'd better call you. We're going to go see the vaudeville at the Empire. There, that's what I want to do, Lorraine said. I want to see some clowns and acrobats and jugglers. That's just what we'll do, Dunk. Well, we've got to do an errand first, said Charlie. Perhaps we'll see you there. All right, you snob. Goodbye, beautiful little girl. Goodbye. Honoria bobbed politely. Somehow an unwelcome encounter. They liked him because he was functioning, because he was serious. They wanted to see him because he was stronger than they were now, because they wanted to draw certain sustenance from his strength. At the Empire, Honoria proudly refused to sit upon her father's folded coat. She was already an individual with a code of her own, and Charlie was more and more absorbed by the desire of putting a little bit of himself into her before she crystallized utterly. It was hopeless to try to know her in so short a time. Between the acts, they came upon Duncan and Lorraine in the lobby where the band was playing. Have a drink? All right, but not up at the bar. We'll take a table. The perfect father. Listening abstractedly to Lorraine, Charlie watched Honoria's eyes leave their table, and he followed them wistfully about the room, wondering what they saw. He met her glance, and she smiled. I like that lemonade, she said. What had she said? What had he expected? Going home in a taxi afterward, he pulled her over until her head rested against his chest. Darling, do you ever think about your mother? Yes, sometimes, she answered vaguely. Well, I don't want you to forget her. Have you got a picture of her? Yes, I think so. Anyhow, Aunt Marion has. Why don't you want me to forget her? Because she loved you so very much. Well, I loved her too. They were silent for a moment. Daddy, I want to come and live with you, she said suddenly. His heart leaped. He had wanted it to come like this. But aren't you perfectly happy? Yes, but I love you better than anybody, and you love me better than anybody, don't you, now that Mummy's dead? Of course I do. But you won't always like me best, honey. You'll grow up and meet somebody your own age and go marry him and forget you ever even had a daddy. Yes, that's true, she agreed tranquilly. He didn't go in. He was coming back at 9 o'clock, and he wanted to keep himself fresh for the new thing he must say then. When you're safe inside, just show yourself in that window. All right. Goodbye, dads. He waited in the dark street until she appeared, all warm and glowing in the window above, and kissed her fingers out into the night. So we get the sense now that really his trip has been about coming to ask for Honoria back legally, and she's the one who actually brings it up first. He hasn't mentioned it. Aunt Marion didn't say anything. She actually says, Dad, I want to come live with you. And that just makes his heart leap. He's so happy because that's the thing that he was hoping she wanted, and that what happened with this trip. So now he says, I'm coming back at 9 o'clock that night, and I know I'll have to say something new to them. And he knows he's going to have to ask them for custody of Honoria back, and as her aunt, Marion, is probably not going to be too thrilled because she doesn't really trust Charlie. Part 3. They were waiting. Marion sat behind the coffee service in a dignified black dinner dress that just faintly suggested mourning. Lincoln was walking up and down with the animation of one who had already been talking. They were as anxious as he was to get to the question. He opened it almost immediately. I suppose you know what I want to see you about, why I really came to Paris. Marion played with the black stars on her necklace and frowned. I'm awfully anxious to have a home, he continued, and I'm awfully anxious to have Honoria in it. I appreciate your taking Honoria in for her mother's sake, but things have changed now. He hesitated, and then he continued more forcefully. Changed radically with me, and I want to ask you to reconsider the matter. It would be silly for me to deny that about 3 years ago I was acting badly. Marion looked up at him with hard eyes. But that's all over, as I told you. I haven't had more than a drink a day for over a year now, and I take that drink deliberately, so the idea of alcohol won't get too big in my imagination. You see the idea. No, said Marion succinctly. Well, it's a sort of stunt I set myself. It keeps the matter in proportion. I get you, said Lincoln. You don't want to admit it's got any attraction for you. So Charlie is a recovering alcoholic, and I don't think this is the AA plan, but his plan is to have one drink a day just so it doesn't get too big in his mind, and after that one drink he stops. And Lincoln hits the nail on the head. He says, I get it. You don't want to admit that alcohol could beat you. You want to be able to say, I can have a drink a day and not become an alcoholic again. Which does not make Marion happy, of course. Something like that. Sometimes I forget and I don't even take my drink, but I try to take it. Anyhow, I couldn't afford to drink in my position. The people I represent are more than satisfied with what I've done, and I'm bringing my sister over from Burlington to keep house for me. And I want awfully bad to have Honoria, too. You know that even when her mother and I weren't getting along well, we never let anything that happened touch Honoria. I know she's fond of me, and I'm able to take care of her, and, well, there you are. How do you feel about it? He knew that now he would have to take a beating. So he knows this is going to be bad, okay? Marion's going to hit him with every blessed thing she can think of from the past, and he's considering himself, all I got to do is just keep my mouth shut, take the beating, and she'll have nowhere to go with it. If I turn every little thing into an argument, then we're going to have problems. I just take the beating, apologize, and say I'm not like that anymore. So that's his plan. He knew that now he would have to take a beating. It would last an hour or 2 hours, and it would be difficult, but if he modulated his inevitable resentment to the chastened attitude of a reformed sinner, he might win his point in the end. Keep your temper, he told himself. You don't want to be justified, you just want Honoria. Lincoln spoke first. Well, we've been talking it over ever since we got your letter last month. And we're happy to have Honoria here. She's a dear little thing, and we're glad to be able to help her, but of course that isn't the question. Marion interrupted suddenly. How long are you going to stay sober, Charlie? She asked. Permanently, I hope. How can anybody count on that? You know, I never did drink heavily until I gave up business and came over here with nothing to do. Then Helen and I began to run around with... Please leave Helen out of it. I can't bear to hear you talk about her like that. He stared at her grimly. He had never been certain of how fond each other the sisters were in life. My drinking only lasted about a year and a half, from the time we came over until I collapsed. It was enough time. It was enough time, he agreed. So he's changing his attitude. He wants to say, you know, you don't understand, whatever, put up a defense for himself, but he just says, you're right. I wasted a lot of my life drinking. You're right. Well, my duty is entirely to Helen, she said. I try to think of what she would have wanted me to do, and frankly, from the night you did that terrible thing, you haven't really existed for me. I can't help that. She was my sister. Yes, he said. When she was dying, she asked me to look out for Honoria. Why, if you hadn't been in a sanitarium, then it might have helped matters. Okay, so Helen died, and she said, first of all, Marion says, frankly, the night you did that terrible thing, you haven't really existed for me, so we don't know what that terrible thing is. I do, because I've read this 10 times, but you don't know what the thing is. So obviously Charlie did something bad to his wife, Helen, and Marion can't really forgive him for it. On top of it, When Helen was dying, she asked her sister to watch out for Honoria because Charlie was in a sanitarium. Now, a sanitarium is rehab, what we would call today rehab. If you hadn't been in a sanitarium, then it might have helped matters. He had no answer. I'll never in my life be able to forget the morning when Helen knocked at my door, soaked to the skin and shivering, and said you'd locked her out. Charlie gripped the sides of the chair. This was more difficult than he expected. He wanted to launch out into a long expostulation and explanation, but he only said, the night I locked her out, and she interrupted him. I don't feel up to going over that again. After a moment's silence, Lincoln said, we're getting off the subject. You want Marion to set aside her legal guardianship and give you Honoria. I think the main point for her is whether she has confidence in you or not. I don't blame Marion, Charlie said slowly, but I think she can have entire confidence in me. I had a good record up to 3 years ago. Of course, it's within human possibilities. I might go wrong again at any time. But if we wait much longer, I'll lose Honoria's childhood and my chance for a home. He shook his head. I'll simply lose her, don't you see? Yes, I see, said Lincoln. Well, why didn't you think of all this before? Marion asked. Well, I suppose I did, from time to time, but Helen and I were getting along badly. When I consented to that guardianship, I was flat on my back in the sanitarium, and the market had cleaned me out. I knew I'd acted badly, and I thought if it would bring Helen any peace, well, I'd agree to anything. But now it's different. I'm functioning. I'm behaving damn well, so far as... Please don't swear at me, Marion said. He looked at her, startled. With each remark, the force of her dislike became more and more apparent. She had built up all of her fear of life into one wall and faced it towards him. This little reproof was probably the result of some trouble with the cook several hours before. Charlie became increasingly alarmed at leaving Honoria in this atmosphere of hostility against himself, for sooner or later it would come out. In a word here, a shake of the head there, and some of that distrust would be irrevocably implanted in Honoria. But he pulled his temper down out of his face and shut it up inside of him. He had won the point, for Lincoln realized the absurdity of Marion's remark and asked her lightly since when she had objected to the word damn. So, Charlie says, I've been doing damn well. And she says, don't curse at me. And Lincoln's like, come on, honey, you're being a little bit overdramatic here. So even Lincoln now realizes, like, okay, now she's just hating him for hate's sake. It's got nothing to do. He's apologized 10 different ways. We don't know the terrible thing he did exactly yet. He locked Helen out one night. Okay, we don't know why he did that. And another thing, Charlie said, I'm able to give her certain advantages now. I'm going to take a French governess to Prague with me, and I've got a lease on a new apartment. Okay, a French governess would be like a nanny. And the reason he stops himself is because he realizes he's bragging about how much... He's not intentionally doing it, but he's realizing I'm telling them how much money I have again. And they're like hard up here without a whole ton of money, so maybe I shouldn't bring up money again. He stopped, realizing he was blundering. They couldn't be expected to accept with equanimity the fact that his income was again twice as large as their own. I suppose you can give her more luxuries than we can, said Marion. When you were throwing away money, we were living along watching every 10 francs. I suppose you'll start doing it again. Oh, no, he said. I've learned. I worked hard for 10 years, until I got lucky in the market, like so many people, terribly lucky. It didn't seem any use working anymore, so I quit. But it won't happen again. There was a long silence. All of them felt their nerves straining, and for the first time in a year, Charlie actually wanted a drink. He was sure now that Lincoln Peters wanted him to have his child. So after the beating, he knows Lincoln's on his side, but we still got to convince Marion. Marion shuddered suddenly. Part of her saw that Charlie's feet were planted on the earth now, and her own maternal feeling recognized the naturalness of his desire. But she had lived for a long time with a prejudice founded on a curious disbelief in her sister's happiness, and which, in the shock of one terrible night, had turned to hatred for him. It had all happened at a point in her life when the discouragement of ill health and adverse circumstances made it necessary for her to believe in a tangible villainy and a tangible villain. In other words, the death of her sister came at the worst possible time in her life, when she was already upset with her other things going on in her life, and she kind of has turned everything against Charlie instead of saying, okay, well, Charlie's one thing and my own life issues are another thing. Well, I can't help what I think, she cried out suddenly. "How much you were responsible for Helen's death, I don't know. It's something you have to square with your own conscience." An electric current of agony surged through him, and for a moment he was almost on his feet, an unuttered sound echoing in his throat. He hung on to himself for a moment, and then another moment. So he wants to jump up and yell, but he doesn't. He chills. "Now, hold on there," said Lincoln uncomfortably. "I never thought you were responsible for that." "Yes, Helen died of heart trouble," Charlie said dully. "Yes, heart trouble." Marion spoke as if the phrase had another meaning for her. Ooh. Then, in the flatness that followed her outburst, she saw him plainly, and she knew he had somehow arrived at control over the situation. Glancing at her husband, she found no help from him, and, as abruptly as if it were a matter of no importance, she threw up the sponge. "Oh, do what you like," she cried, springing up from her chair. "She's your child, and I'm not the person to stand in your way. I think if it were my child, I'd rather see her—" She managed to check herself. "Well, you two decide. I can't stand this. I'm sick. I'm going to bed." She hurried out from the room, and after a minute Lincoln said, "It's been a hard day for her. You know how strongly she feels." His voice was almost apologetic. "When a woman gets an idea in her head—" "Of course," said Charlie. "It's going to be all right. I think she sees now that you can provide for the child, and so we can't very well stand in your way, or Honoria's way." "Thank you, Lincoln." "Well, I'd better go along and see how she is." "And I'll be going," said Charlie. He was still trembling when he reached the street, but a walk down the Rue Bonaparte to the quay set him up, and he crossed the scene, fresh and new by the quay lamps. He felt exultant, but back in his room he couldn't sleep. The image of Helen haunted him, Helen whom he had loved so until they had senselessly begun to abuse each other's love and tear it into shreds. On that terrible February night that Marion remembered so vividly, a slow quarrel had gone on for hours. There was a scene at the Florida, and then he attempted to take her home, and then she kissed young Webb at a table, and after that there was what she had hysterically said. Okay, so there was an incident. So they're at a club called the Florida, and she kisses a young man named Webb in plain sight of others. So Charlie gets ticked, so he tries to take her home, and she also, drunkenly says some things hysterically that are rude. And Charlie tried to take her home, but she wouldn't go. So, picking back up with the story. When he arrived home, he turned the key in the lock in wild anger. But how could he know she would arrive an hour later alone? That there would be a snowstorm in which she wandered about in slippers too confused to find a taxi? Then, the aftermath, her escaping pneumonia by a miracle, and all the attendant horror. They were reconciled, but that was just the beginning of the end, and Marion, who had seen with her own eyes, and who imagined it to be one of many scenes from her sister's martyrdom, never forgot. So Helen, his wife, came home late. He had locked the door in anger because she kissed another dude and said some rude stuff. She comes home late and is drunk and too drunk to find a taxi, so she wanders around downtown Paris for a little while in a snowstorm and catches pneumonia. The pneumonia puts her in the hospital, and she recovers, but not fully. And pneumonia can, if you have it long enough and it goes untreated, especially back then, pneumonia can have an effect on your heart to where it can actually affect your heart. So she ended up dying of heart trouble related to the pneumonia because of the fight, because he locked her out because of the fight. So in Marion's mind, it's all his fault. In his mind, it's like, well, how did I know that, she did kiss another dude right in front of me, and how did I know she was going to come home? It was both of their faults, I think. Going over it again in his mind brought Helen nearer, and in the white, soft light that steals upon half-sleep near morning, he found himself talking to her again. She said that he was perfectly right about Honoria, and that she wanted Honoria to be with him. She said she was glad he was being good and doing better, and she said a lot of other things, very friendly things, but she was in a swing, in a white dress, and swinging faster and faster all the time, so that at the end he could not clearly hear all that she said. So the night that he gets Honoria back, or Marion finally agrees, he has a dream of Helen telling him that that's what she would have wanted. So this is part 4. He woke up feeling happy. The door of the world was open again. He made plans, vistas, futures for Honoria and himself, but suddenly he grew sad, remembering all the plans that he and Helen had once made. She had not planned to die. The present was the thing. Work to do and someone to love, but not to love too much, for he knew the injury that a father can do to a daughter or a mother to a son by attaching them too closely. Afterward, out in the world, the child would seek in marriage the marriage partner the same blind tenderness and, failing probably to find it, turn against love and life. There's a little truth to that, F. Scott Fitzgerald's line there, that if a mother loves her son too much or a father his daughter too much, they'll seek that in their marriage partner, and then if they don't get an overly loving spouse, it may ruin their view of love altogether. It was another bright, crisp day. He called Lincoln Peters at the bank where he worked and asked if he could count on taking Honoria when he left for Prague. Lincoln agreed that there was no reason for delay. One thing, the legal guardianship. Marion wanted... Sorry, ignoring a phone call for you guys. There was one thing, the legal guardianship. Marion wanted to retain that a little while longer. She was upset by the whole matter, and it would oil things if she felt that the situation was still in her control for another year. Charlie agreed, wanting only the tangible, visible child. So Marion says, you know what, I'll let you have her, but can I just, we won't undo the legal paperwork yet. You take her, you go to Prague, I'm not going to make a fuss, but we're not going to undo any of the, legality yet. And another year, if you're still sober, I'll sign her back over to you. Then the question of a governess. Charlie sat in a gloomy agency and talked to a cross Bernese and to a buxom Breton peasant, neither of whom he could have endured. There were others whom he would see tomorrow. He lunched with Lincoln Peters at Griffin's, trying to keep down his exultation. "There's nothing quite like your own child," Lincoln said, "but you understand how Marion feels, too." "She's forgotten how hard I worked for 7 years there," Charlie said. "She just remembers the one night." "Well, that's another thing," Lincoln hesitated. "Well, you and Helen were tearing around Europe, throwing money away. We were just barely getting along. I didn't touch any of the prosperity because I never got ahead enough to carry anything but my insurance. Well, I think Marion felt there was some kind of injustice in it, you not even working towards the end and getting richer and richer." "But it went just as quick as it came," said Charlie. "Yes, and a lot of it stayed in the hands of chasseurs and saxophone players in Maitre D's hotel. Well, the big party's over. I just... Oh, wait. Nope, I had the right voice. Yes, a lot of it stayed in the hands of chasseurs and saxophone players in Maitre D's hotel. Well, the big party's over now. I just said that to explain Marion's feelings about those crazy years. If you drop in about 6 o'clock tonight, before Marion's too tired, we'll settle the details on the spot." So he kind of alludes to another little problem she had with him, is that he was super wealthy, and they're barely getting along, and he's giving out $100 tips at the 100-franc note tips to bartenders and maitre d's, and meanwhile, his own sister-in-law and brother-in-law are barely getting by. So it's kind of like, man, you wasted all that money, and you had people who would have put it to really good use in your family. Okay. Back at his hotel, Charlie found a pneumatique, which is just a fancy word for message, that had been redirected from the Ritz bar where Charlie had left his address for the purpose of finding a certain man. "Dear Charlie, you were so strange when you saw you the other day I wondered if I did something to offend you. If so, I'm not conscious of it. In fact, I have thought about you too much for the last year, and it's always been in the back of my mind that I might see you if I came over here. We did have such good times that crazy spring, like the night you and I stole the butcher's tricycle, and the time we tried to call on the president, and you had the old derby rim and the wire cane. Everybody seems so old lately, but I don't feel a bit old. Couldn't we get together sometime today for old time's sake? I've got a vile hangover for the moment, but we'll be feeling better this afternoon, and we'll look for you about 5 in the sweet shop at the Ritz. Always devotedly, Lorraine." Uh-oh. So he gets a note from Lorraine saying, hey, let's meet. Now, Lorraine's a married woman at this point, but apparently they were both married and still got drunk enough to pedal the butcher's tricycle around downtown Paris and try to call on the president. So, in the middle of the night. So, Lorraine says, can't we just get together one time? Charlie is not jumping at this opportunity. His first feeling was one of awe that he had actually, in his mature years, stolen a tricycle and pedaled Lorraine all over